For those who are studying the international covenants and beginning to realize just exactly what they are, when you look at these documentations, you understand that they express a dualistic nature of law, if you will. On one hand, they express our fundamental rights and freedoms, our common law rights, our natural rights as men and women. And on the other hand, they express privileges, rights, and benefits that can be expressed in a democratic society. So when we look into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2, we find the following. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes to respect and to ensure to all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction the rights recognized in the present covenant, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Now, when you look at the legal definition of individual, when you check legal dictionaries, it says individual. As a noun, this term denotes a single person, as distinguished from a group or class, and also very commonly a private or natural person, as distinguished from a partnership, corporation, or association. But it is said that this restrictive signification is not necessarily inherent in the word, and that it may, in proper cases, include artificial persons, and then they say see also person. As an adjective, individual means pertaining or belonging to or characteristics of one single person, either in opposition to a firm, association, or corporation, or considered in his relation thereto. So when you use the word individual, you're talking about a single person, commonly a natural person, or you're talking about a single person as a man or woman, the human being. Now, when you use the word individual, it also can break down in the proper cases. It includes artificial, the legal person, the artificial person. So the legislative and executive powers within our country have to respect and ensure all the rights recognized in the covenant. That's their obligation to us as men and women or as citizens. And in Article 2.2 it says, where not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures, each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. So we start and we see that our state party has the obligation to respect and to ensure to all individuals the rights recognized in the covenant. Individuals can mean the man or the woman, or individual can refer to citizen. We're going to see this come out within the covenant, the two different capacities. Further to this, it's saying that if these rights and freedoms are not already expressed in your domestic laws, then you have the obligation to construct a new constitutional process, and you have to bring forth these laws through this process, or you have to adopt laws or other measures, whatever may be. You have the obligation to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. So that was the obligation that rested upon our state parties, the executive and the legislative branch. Now, the controlling medium is the international covenants. The rights and freedoms expressed in the covenants, they bind Canada, United States, Russia, the UK, New Zealand, Great Britain, and so forth. These rights must be brought forth through the constitutional process. This is an obligation, a legal obligation. And here in Canada, they were brought forth through the Constitution Act of 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When we look into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 5, we find the following article written this way. Nothing in the present covenant may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person, so no judge, no mayor, no executive power, no state power, nobody, any right to engage in any activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant. Again, we are seeing that the controlling mechanism concerning how our countries can create laws is governed by the International Covenant. Canada cannot limit an individual's rights and freedoms apart from what the International Covenant allows it to do. Canada is under obligation to follow the international covenants. The covenants are the controlling mechanism that governs domestic laws. Canada cannot limit human rights and freedoms unless it is in accordance with the covenant. Canada cannot just make up laws and regulations that go against your fundamental rights. There always has to be a provision, a measure in place that allows you to exercise those rights. Remember, the obligation upon Canada and the subsequent other countries is to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. So the natural rights, the fundamental rights, are common law rights that are expressed in the covenant. Our countries have to adopt laws or other measures to give effect to these rights and freedoms, not hide them. Let us look at a fundamental right and freedom that is universally recognized, which has been enumerated in the covenant, and which Canada and the other countries are under obligation to respect. When you look into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 16, you find the following. It says, everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Now the subject, designation, or player being brought forth here is the everyone. And we know that refers to the man or the woman, the plural of that, the human being. And the human being shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. You, as a human being, have a natural right. This right is binding on Canada. You can enter into recognition as an artificial person, that incorporated personality that we've been talking about in my past few videos. This is an option that you have as a human being, not an obligation. No one can force you. Canada, however, through the Governor General, is not respecting this fundamental right. You are being forced, and that word is spelled wrong, but you are being forced to take recognition as a juridical personality, that legal person. When you look into the Ontario Municipal Act, you see the following. Municipality means a geographic area whose inhabitants are incorporated. And again, municipality, in this act, a reference to a municipality is a reference to its geographical area or to the municipal corporation as the context requires. So here, we are being incorporated into the corporate body, and we are being forced to use our right to recognition as a person before the law. Body corporate. The inhabitants of every municipality are incorporated as a body corporate. So you see where you, as a human being, as a man or a woman, you have the right to recognition as a person, no obligation. Through the enactment, through their statutes and regulations, they're incorporating you as a body corporate. They're forcing you to use the right to recognition as the person. City of Toronto Act. The City of Toronto is hereby continued as a body corporate that is composed of the inhabitants of its geographic area. And municipality means a geographic area whose inhabitants are incorporated. A human being has a right to choose to enter into recognition as a person. The Lieutenant Governor in Council is not allowing you to exercise this right and freedom. This office is making decisions and determinations about your rights and freedoms. It is through the following operation of law that they are designating us as legal persons, as incorporated officers of this corporation. This operation of law is against international law and against human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now remember, we read just before that the executive power or the legislative power, they're not supposed to take any activity, engage in any activity, or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of our rights and freedoms recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant. So these guys are incorporating us into their corporation, forcing us to use our right to recognition as a person before the law. And they're not supposed to be doing that to us. We have a choice. According to our individual fundamental rights and freedoms, Do we want to be incorporated and considered a legal person, that subject or servant, officer of Her Majesty, or do we choose not to? This is our fundamental right. Yet through this enactment, the governor in council is not respecting our rights and is trying to limit them to an extent greater than provided for in the international covenants. By automatically considering us and incorporating us into the local government, this action has violated our individual human rights and freedoms. Individual human right and freedom to choose to enter into recognition as an incorporated person. The Lieutenant Governor, through legislation and enactments, incorporates you without asking you. You are now considered a legal person, the officer of the corporation, who is under the control of the enactments. This is a violation of your fundamental right and freedom. This right is not to be abridged or removed, your right to recognition as a person before the law. There is no operation of law that permits them to force you to enter into recognition as that legal person. Now, the Supreme Court states it as this when they're talking about Article 16 of the ICCPR. It says it guarantees to all human beings the basic human right to be recognized as a person before the law. Pursuant to this provision, the individual is endowed with the capacity to be a person before the law. Not an obligation, but a capacity. You can take the capacity or designation as a driver. You can take the capacity or designation as a student, but you don't have the obligation. And to be recognized as a potential bearer of legal rights and obligations. So if you take on the recognition, right? If you're a man or a woman and you take on the recognition of a class of person, then you're going to take on the legal obligations. You're going to take on the legal benefits, privileges, obligations, whatever it may be. But you have no obligation to enter into this. That's why when the judge talks about it, he qualifies it as being potential bearer. And it says that you have the capacity to be the person, not the obligation. The existence of legal personality of itself says nothing to the extent of the rights and obligations of the persons in question. So the fact that there's a legal personality in operation in law, it doesn't determine what rights, duties, and obligations you're gonna exercise or you're gonna take on. What determines that is what recognition before the law you take. If you take recognition before the law, for example, as a student, then you have obligations as a student. If you take recognition before the law as a driver, then you have obligations as a driver. If you take recognition before the law as an officer under the IT Act, then you have obligations as an officer. You have the capacity to be the person. You have the right to enter into recognition as a person, and if you do so, then you're going to bear the legal obligations of that designation. The Constitution Act of Canada 1982 is one of the measures, one of the mechanisms of law that the state party here used in order to fulfill their obligations. Remember, we read above, it said we're not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. So here we're coming to Canada and we're looking into the 1982 Constitution Act of Canada. And what is this Constitution Act of Canada? It's an expression of international law. That's what it is. It's an expression of law in a democratic society, and law are natural rights and fundamental freedoms. The rule of law concerning that. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, the Constitution Act of Canada 1982. The Constitution Act is the supreme law of Canada, and any law, enactment, or regulation that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is, to the extent of the inconsistency, of no force or effect. So if the executive powers or the legislative powers create enactments and regulations, and in these enactments and regulations they are going against your fundamental rights and freedoms as they are brought forth in the Constitution Act of Canada, then it states that these laws, they are of no force or effect against you. And it further states in Article 26 of the Constitution Act of Canada The guarantee in this charter, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, of certain rights and freedoms shall not be construed as denying the existence of any other rights or freedoms that exist in Canada. And this article of law allows you to directly call on the rights and freedoms contained in the International Covenant. It allows you to bypass the Charter itself if the need should arise. The Constitution Act is the supreme law of Canada, an expression of international law. The Constitution Act guarantees certain rights and freedoms and does not deny other rights and freedoms that exist in Canada. Other rights and freedoms available in Canada, the rights and freedoms of the international covenants. Now also, the state party, the executive and legislative members, they had to adopt such laws or other measures to give effect to the rights. There are other measures outside the Constitution Act that promote and protect human rights, such as personal understanding and personal claims of recognition and seeking remedy against the executive powers. Remember, if you look in my other videos, we saw that Russia did the exact same thing with their Constitution Act in 1993. They brought forth their international obligation through their Constitution Act, and actually it's a lot clearer than Canada's Constitution Act concerning fundamental rights and freedoms and the difference between man and the citizen. In America, it was through the Supremacy Act, Supremacy Clause, and the U.S. reservations and declarations concerning the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We saw in New Zealand how it was through the Constitution Act also. So all of our countries are using the same operation of law, the same mechanism of law is being used. Now, the government is a corporate body, a body corporate for public right. They are trying to incorporate you into this body. You have the right to play the role of juridical person, of officer of the corporation, not the obligation. A right is something you must exercise, you must bring forth. The government's actions are against your fundamental rights, so you must exercise your right to counter what they are doing to you. Now, in the Constitution Act of Canada 1982, it says every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in an election of members of a House of Commons or of a legislative assembly and to be qualified for membership therein. Why didn't it say here everyone in Canada has the right to vote in an election? Because you can be operating under another designation, not of citizen, and you do not have the right to vote. Because the right to vote has been given to this class of person, titled or designated citizen. Remember, we read above what the Supreme Court said about the capacity of persons. It says that if you are recognized as that capacity, as that legal person, then you have the potential to be the bearer of legal rights and obligations. Well, in our domestic laws and in all the countries' domestic laws, it's the designation of citizen that has the right to vote, not a man or woman. And the citizen is the incorporated officer, the subject, the servant, officer of Her Majesty. Now, when election time comes, will the government come with a gun and policy enforcers and demand that you go to the polling station and cast a vote? Will they come and threaten you and force you to vote? No, of course not. A citizen has the right to vote, not an obligation. The law says every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in an election. Now, a right doesn't produce an obligation. That's why come voting time, they're not going to come and knock on your door and say, hey, you better go use your right. Now, in international law, everyone, it's changed back. It's no longer the citizen, but they bring forth the designation of everyone. And it says everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country. So they're bringing forth a right. They're saying as a man or a woman, you have the right to take part in the government of your country. And if you exercise that right, if you choose to use that right, then your designation, your capacity will be that of citizen. And you will partake of the government of your country through voting for who you want to be running your country. Now, look at Article 16 of the Covenant, our natural fundamental right and freedom. It says everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Are we talking about bringing forth obligations, or are these rights that we can choose to exercise? Is this producing an obligation upon you? When they say you have to be the officer under the ITA Act, when they say you have to play the role of legal person, of incorporated individual into the corporation, are they breaching your fundamental right and freedom? They're forcing you to use your right to recognition as a person before the law. But come voting time, they don't force you to use your right to vote. They're breaching your fundamental right and freedom. And they're doing it based upon the fact that we are in ignorance. They had the obligation to teach us our fundamental rights and freedoms and help us to learn the expression of our natural rights, and they never did. A right is something that can be used, but does not create an obligation. A citizen has a right to vote, but no obligation. A human being has the right to partake of the government, but no obligation. A man or a woman, the plural human beings, has the right to recognition as an incorporated person, the officer of Canada, the federal juristic unit called Canada, before the law, but no obligation. This is one of the major ways that our fundamental rights and freedoms are being limited, taken, or removed from us, contrary to their obligations. The state party is forcing us or taking implied consent that we are willing to play the role of juridical person under the enactment and that we have accepted this designation. Now, in doing so, we have accepted the legal obligations and duties under the enactment that attach to that class of person. So let us look at some of our fundamental rights that are available for us as human beings within the international covenants that place an obligation upon our state parties, upon our governments. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23, it states that everyone, now they're talking about the man or the woman, has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Now, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is not a binding international treaty upon our countries. But this same right was expressed within the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a legal binding treaty, which is a legal binding covenant upon our countries. In Article 6, it states, the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work. Okay, let's stop there. We have a right to work, just like the citizen has the right to vote. And because we have a right to vote, it does not mean we are obligated to use the right to vote. And because we have the right to work, does not mean that we are obligated to use the right to work. Now, this right to work includes, now when they use this terminology here includes, they're closing off the definition of what working means. What they're about to describe for you is the reason for working. It is the only reason for working. So, which includes the right of every man or woman, everyone again, to the opportunity to gain his living. So you have a chance to gain your living. You have an ability to gain your living. And you can gain your living by work which you freely choose or accept to do. And the state party will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. Now, the subject or player being brought forth here is not the citizen. It's the everyone. Why? Because everyone refers to the human being. And as a human being, you have the right to work. You can make the decision, I'm going to work. And if you make that decision, what you are doing is you have decided to gain your own living by work. That's the reason for doing this. You gain your own living, and the law is declaring that you freely choose and accept to do this. We understand that that's not the case. We're placed into secular education through the government systems, and we're forced to use the right to work. However, the actual operation, the actual mechanism of the law stated that working was a right, not an obligation. Now, everyone has a right to work. A human being has the right to work. Everyone has the right to gain his living by work. This working to gain a living is something you freely choose or accept. It is not an obligation, but a right you can exercise. It is an economic, social, and cultural right that you can exercise. You can exercise this right and freely choose to work in order to gain a living for yourself and your family. Again, no one can force you to work. The way the system is set up, they make it next to impossible to enjoy a living and teach us only that we must pursue, earn, and gain a living through using our right to work. You do have another right, another freedom, that is expressed in the same covenant. And as always, with a right, you can choose to use it or not. In the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 25, we find the following article of law. Every citizen has the right to a standard of living, adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. It's not what it says, right? Everyone, the man or the woman, has the right to a standard of living, adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. Personal pronouns, not it, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Again, this is not a binding obligation upon our state parties, but this right was transferred into an international covenant, which then produced the binding obligation upon the executive and legislative powers of our countries. In the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 11, we find the following. The states, parties to the present covenant, recognize the right of everyone, again, the man or the woman, to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. So we, as men and women, have a natural right, a fundamental right. We have a right to a standard of living. Now, this standard of living, we don't have to pursue after. Remember before, in Article 6, if we use the right to work, we have that right. And if we use the right to work, then we have to gain our own living by the work that they are declaring that we are freely choosing to do. So they force us to go into education and force us to use the right to work. However, if we choose not to use the right to work, and we choose to use the right to have an adequate standard of living, then the obligation falls upon the state party, the executive party, the legislative party, to make sure that we have the security of our person. Everyone has a right to a standard of living. This standard of living lists food, clothing, housing, medical care, and so forth. Everyone also has the right to the improvement of this standard of living conditions. This is a right that you have, that you do not have to pursue or have to work to have. It is a human right and freedom that you can exercise. Now, the federal prisoners across Canada and the provincial prisoners across Canada, when you look and do a research, the government is declaring that they are paying for federal prisoners up to $324 a day for federal. And if my mind is correct, and don't quote me on the provincial price, but you can go and check, it was something like $290 something a day. And they are claiming that they have to give these amounts to the prisons in order to respect the prisoners' human rights and fundamental freedoms. Well, if they're willing to dispense that amount of money for prisoners to respect their fundamental rights and freedoms, I think every human being, every man or woman and child across Canada is entitled to the same treatment. Now, if you understand what's going on, these prisons within the law are set up as corporations. Excuse me, a tickle in my throat. And these corporations are making profit off of the taxpayer. So for every prisoner that these jails are housing, they bill the government. They send a bill, an invoice to the government, and say it cost us so much money to house and feed and take care of this prisoner. It does not cost them close to $300 a day for a prisoner. They're pocketing this money. It's a corrupt system. It's the same thing that's going on in the United States of America. Their prisons are full of individuals for silly crimes that are being committed. Yes, there are some that deserve to be in there for their actions, but the majority of them are in there for simple possession, for example, of marijuana, or breaching a bylaw, or not paying a ticket, or not paying a whatever it may be. And these individuals are in prison, and the prison that are housing them are billing the federal government at a huge amount, at a great cost, and the government is paying these bills. The prisons in our country are a huge moneymaker. The idea of free human beings enjoying civil and political freedom and freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby everyone may enjoy his civil and political rights as well as his economic, social, and cultural rights. This is the preamble of the covenants. And the preamble is the explanation why the covenants are there, the reason that the covenants are brought forth. When you read a preamble in law, it's meant to give you a description. It's meant to clarify what this law is about. And here we see that the covenants are bringing forth the idea of free human beings, enjoying civil and political freedom, and freedom from fear and want. And this can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby the human being, the man or the woman, may enjoy his civil and political rights, as well as his economic, social, and cultural rights. Well, in order for you as a man or a woman to be free from fear and want, there has to be conditions created, right? If you want to be free from fear and want, you have to go out and work for it. You have to go out and pursue, earn, and gain after this. Put money in the bank, buy food, pay for your housing, and you're going to be free from fear and want. However, here the covenant is saying that in order for the man or the woman to be free from fear and want, this can only be achieved if conditions are created, whereby that man or woman can enjoy his rights and not pursue after them. As the citizen, as the person, they place you in the position to work and to pursue after your rights. You have to create your own freedom from fear and want. However, if you exercise your natural rights, you have the right to an adequate standard of living. And this adequate standard of living is meant to fulfill the reason for the covenant, which is what? Which is to lift you out of poverty, which is to lift you out of the fear from fear and want. And again, there's enough resources which within each of our countries to fulfill this obligation. You can see, as a human being, enjoying a living and enjoying these rights without any obligation to anyone. We have the ability to do this. In fact, as a human being, a man or a woman, the state party, Canada, has obligations to you concerning your human rights and freedoms, the which some of you may be seeing now for the first time. In the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 3, it states, the state parties to the present covenant undertakes to ensure the equal right of citizens, no right, the equal right of men and women to the enjoyment, see, not the pursuit. You don't have to pursue after your rights when you take the designation of men and women. You can enjoy them, to the enjoyment of all economic, social, and cultural rights set forth in the present covenant. So as men and women, you and I can enjoy our rights. And one of these enjoyments would be to have an adequate standard of living provided for by the state party. However, what state party does is they place us into the class of under the designation of a class of persons, and they force us to use our right to work. And when you strip it down here in Canada, you understand through the IT Act, when you exercise your right to work, you're actually working as an officer of Canada, and then you're being taxed upon it. So where you should have the right to an adequate living, and you should have the right to adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continued improvement of this living condition. So this is not closing off the list here. It doesn't say includes. It says including. This list is left open to what you can enjoy. While you should be enjoying your life and pursuing after happiness, which is the reason why if you're religious or believe in God, which is the reason why God created you. If you're a naturalist, well, it's great to be pursuing. I mean, it's great to have freedom, not to be bound up. And that's what they're doing. Why? Because they're forcing you to use your right to work. And you talk to people about this and they think you're nuts. They'll say, "What do you mean I have the right to an adequate living?" It's because you don't understand what's transpired against your natural rights. You don't understand what you're carrying around in your pocket. You don't understand the power of your inalienable rights that you have. And they're being expressed here in the covenant. And it's telling you, listen, you as a man or a woman, you have the right to an adequate standard of living, and you can exercise this right. But the executive powers and the legislative powers of our country don't want us to know about this. They don't want us to understand that this is an obligation upon them. They only want us to be aware of this. And they want to place us into a capacity of a person under the law and send us out there to use this right, thereby breaching their obligation towards us.